The room went silent the moment the camera zoomed in on the cockpit. My brother dropped his beer. My mother covered her mouth. My father leaned forward so quickly that his recliner nearly tipped. And for the first time in years, nobody said a word. On the television screen, the announcer's voice echoed across the living room. Leading today's demonstration flight is Major Emily Parker. My name, my face, my aircraft. Broadcast live to millions of Americans. The same brother who had called me the family failure stared at the screen as if he'd seen a ghost. The same parents who had spent years defending him couldn't look away. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke, because the pilot flying across the sky wasn't some stranger. It was me, the daughter they'd overlooked, the sister they'd underestimated, the woman they'd stopped believing in years ago. And the strangest part? I had never lied to them. Not once. They simply never cared enough to ask. But to understand how we got there, you have to go back long before the television cameras, back before the Air Force, back before the uniforms, back before the air shows, back to a small town in Texas, back to the day my brother's dream became my burden, and eventually, my future. My name is Emily Parker. I'm 34 years old now, but this story really began when I was a little girl growing up outside Wichita Falls, Texas. Back then, everybody knew who Jake Parker was. Jake was my older brother. 3 years older, 3 years louder, 3 years more confident, and according to nearly everyone who knew us, 3 years more talented. If there was a baseball game, Jake was the star. If there was a school event, Jake got attention. If there was a family gathering, relatives asked about Jake first. I wasn't ignored exactly. I was simply second. Second place becomes familiar when you're the younger sibling of someone everybody expects great things from. The funny thing is that I adored him. I really did. When I was 7 years old, I wanted to wear the same baseball cap he wore. When I was 10, I copied the way he talked. When I was 12, I followed him around so much that he started calling me his shadow. Most little sisters probably understand that feeling. The desire to be included, the desire to belong, the desire to hear an older sibling say they were proud of you. Back then, Jake was my hero. And Jake had one dream: flying. He loved airplanes. Loved them. Our bedroom walls were covered with aircraft posters. Fighter jets, bombers, military aviation magazines stacked everywhere. Air shows were practically holidays in our family. Every summer, Dad loaded us into the truck before sunrise. We'd drive for hours just to watch military aircraft roar across the Texas sky. Jake would stand there with his eyes locked on the horizon, completely mesmerized. One year after watching an F-16 demonstration team perform, he turned to Dad and said something I'll never forget. "One day that'll be me." Dad smiled. "I believe it." Mom smiled too. So do I. Nobody laughed. Nobody doubted him. Not for a second. And honestly, neither did I. Because Jake had the kind of confidence that made other people believe. As we got older, the dream only grew. Jake joined Civil Air Patrol, earned flight experience, studied aviation constantly. Everything in his life pointed toward becoming a military pilot. My high school teachers talked about him like he was already destined for greatness. The future seemed written. Then reality arrived. It arrived quietly, in the form of a medical examination. I was 15 when it happened. Jake was 18. I remember the day he came home. No excitement. No smile. No celebration. Just silence. The kind of silence that tells you something important has broken. Dad sat with him at the kitchen table for hours. Mom cried. Nobody explained anything to me. Not immediately. I eventually learned the truth. Jake had failed a medical qualification required for the flight path he wanted. Not because he lacked intelligence, not because he lacked skill. His body simply didn't meet the standard. Years of dreaming ended in a single appointment. Just like that, the Air Force dream disappeared, and something inside Jake disappeared with it. The months afterward were difficult, harder than anyone expected. Jake became angry, then withdrawn, then bitter. Not all at once, slowly. Like watching a storm gather in the distance. At first everyone understood, even me. Losing a dream hurts, especially when you've built your identity around it. Mom and Dad became protective, extremely protective. Every conversation revolved around Jake. Every family decision revolved around Jake. Every concern revolved around Jake. Again, I understood, at least initially. But over time, something changed. The family didn't just comfort him. They began excusing him. Everything. His temper, his attitude, his mistakes, his complaints. No matter what happened, the explanation was always the same. He's been through a lot, and he had. But eventually that explanation became permission. Permission to stay angry. Permission to blame others. Permission to stop moving forward. Meanwhile, life kept moving, including mine. One afternoon while helping Dad clean the garage, I found an old aviation magazine. The cover featured an Air Force pilot climbing into a fighter jet. I stared at the image for several minutes. Something stirred inside me. The same feeling Jake used to talk about. The same excitement. The same fascination. That night, I started researching military aviation. Quietly. Secretly. I never told anyone. Not even Jake. Especially not Jake, because by then I already knew how he'd react. The dream belonged to him, not me. At least that's what everyone seemed to believe. Years passed. I graduated high school, worked hard, stayed focused, made plans. Whenever I talked about military service, Jake rolled his eyes. Whenever I talked about aviation, he laughed. The first time he called me the family failure, I was 21. We were sitting around the dinner table. I had just mentioned applying for officer training. Jake smirked. That's ambitious. Dad looked uncomfortable. Mom stared at her plate. I ignored the comment. Then Jake laughed. You've always been the family failure, Emily. Silence. Nobody corrected him. Nobody defended me. Nobody said a word. The silence hurt more than the insult, because silence can sound a lot like agreement. I looked around the table. My parents avoided eye contact. Jake leaned back in his chair, satisfied. And that's when I learned an important lesson. Sometimes the people who should protect you simply don't. Not because they don't love you, because they're too busy protecting someone else. I never argued, never fought back, never demanded fairness. I simply smiled and kept moving forward. Because while my family was still focused on the dream Jake lost, I was quietly preparing to chase it myself, and none of them had any idea how far I was willing to go. The first time I sat in the cockpit of a military training aircraft, I thought about my brother. Not because he was there. He wasn't. Not because he supported me. He didn't. I thought about him because I knew I was sitting inside the dream he had wanted his entire life. And for a brief moment I felt guilty. That feeling didn't last long. Reality has a way of pushing sentiment aside, especially when you're trying not to fail. When people imagine military flight training, they often picture excitement, speed, adventure, the kind of scenes you see in movies. The truth is much less glamorous. Most days were exhausting. Long hours, constant evaluations, endless studying, pressure that never seemed to disappear. I joined the Air Force shortly after college. At first, nobody in my family took it seriously. Mom assumed it was temporary. Dad thought I'd eventually come home. Jake laughed outright. How long before you quit? I remember that question clearly. We were standing in my parents' driveway. The Texas sun was setting. I'd just finished loading my luggage into the trunk of my car. I looked at him. I'm not quitting. He shrugged. We'll see. That was it. No good luck. No encouragement. No brotherly support. Just doubt. The strange thing is that by then I'd become accustomed to it. Low expectations are surprisingly easy to carry once you've carried them long enough. Military life changed me quickly. Not because it made me tougher, because it forced me to discover how tough I already was. The first year was difficult. Really difficult. There were moments I questioned everything. Moments when failure seemed more likely than success. The standards were demanding. The competition was intense. Everyone around me had talent. Everyone around me wanted the same opportunities. Nobody cared about excuses. Nobody cared about your feelings. Results mattered. Performance mattered. Discipline mattered. And I loved it. For the first time in my life, nobody compared me to Jake. Nobody saw me as somebody's little sister. Nobody viewed me through the lens of family history. I was simply Emily Parker. Responsible for my own success. Responsible for my own failures. It was strangely liberating. One evening during training, I found myself sitting alone outside the barracks. The sun had disappeared. The air was cool. Several aircraft were parked in the distance. Their silhouettes stood against the darkening sky. I remember staring at them for a long time, thinking about home, thinking about family, thinking about the version of myself everyone back in Texas still believed existed. The family failure. The girl who would never accomplish much. The girl nobody worried about because she wasn't the important one. It struck me then how strange life can be. The people who know us longest don't always know us best. Sometimes they become attached to an old version of who we were, even after we've changed, even after we've grown, even after we've become someone entirely different. Boo. Meanwhile, Jake remained the center of gravity back home. At least according to my parents. Every phone call followed the same pattern. Mom would spend 20 minutes talking about Jake, his job, his frustrations, his latest problem, his newest plan. Then she'd ask about me, briefly. Not intentionally, not maliciously, just habit. Years of family dynamics are hard to break. One Christmas I returned home on leave. The visit lasted 4 days. By the second evening, Jake had already found a way to mock my career. We were sitting in the living room watching football. A commercial featuring military aircraft appeared on television. Jake pointed toward the screen. "Remember when I wanted to do that?" Nobody answered. He looked at me. "I guess somebody had to settle for second place." Mom laughed nervously. Dad cleared his throat. Nobody challenged him. Again. I sat quietly. Again. The silence no longer surprised me. What surprised me was how little it hurt. Somewhere along the way, I'd stopped needing their approval. Not completely, but enough. Enough to keep moving. Enough to stay focused. Enough to understand that their opinion wasn't my future. The irony was that Jake himself had inspired my love of aviation. I don't think he ever realized that. When we were kids, I followed him everywhere. Air museums, aviation shows, books about fighter jets, flight simulators. Every interest he loved eventually became something I loved too. The difference was simple. When his path closed, he stopped walking. When mine became difficult, I kept going. That wasn't because I was stronger. It was because by the time I started, I already knew nobody was coming to save me. Nobody was going to carry me. Nobody was going to lower the standards. The responsibility belonged to me. And somehow that made all the difference. So, several years passed. My career advanced steadily. I earned qualifications, completed advanced training, accepted increasingly challenging assignments. Each accomplishment felt meaningful. Not because anyone back home noticed, because I knew how hard I'd worked for it. Success feels different when you've earned it quietly. There's no applause, no celebration, no audience, just private satisfaction. The knowledge that you kept your promises to yourself. One afternoon I received a call from my mother. The conversation began normally. Weather, family news, small-town gossip. Then she casually mentioned Jake. He's been having a rough time lately. I wasn't surprised. There always seemed to be something. What happened? Work isn't going well. I listened. As always. Then she sighed. You know, your brother had such big dreams. The comment wasn't intended to hurt me, but it did. Because I realized something. Even after all these years, my family still viewed Jake as the dreamer. The one with potential. The one whose future mattered. Meanwhile, I was actively living the life he'd once wanted. And somehow they still didn't see it. Not because I hid it. Because they never looked. A few months later, everything changed. I was stationed at an Air Force base in Nevada when the email arrived. At first, I assumed it was routine. Another administrative notice. Another scheduling update. Something ordinary. Instead, it contained an invitation. An opportunity. The kind of opportunity military aviators spend years hoping for. I read it once. Then again. Then a third time. My hands were shaking slightly by the time I finished. Because the selection board had chosen me for something extraordinary. Something prestigious. Something that would place me on a national stage. For several minutes, I simply stared at the screen, unable to process it. Then I thought about Jake, about my parents, about every family dinner where I'd been overlooked, about every joke, every dismissal, every moment of silence, and for the first time I wondered what would happen if they ever discovered who I had become. For most of my career, I believed success would feel dramatic. I imagined some life-changing moment, a celebration, a speech, a crowd applauding. Instead, one of the biggest moments of my life happened in a quiet office while I sat alone in front of a computer screen. No audience, no music, no fanfare, just an email, and a future I never saw coming. Thought, I must have read the message 10 times, maybe more. The words never changed. Neither did the outcome. I had been selected for one of the most prestigious aviation demonstration assignments in the Air Force. The selection process was brutally competitive. Outstanding pilots from across the service applied. Most never made it. Many applied more than once. Some spent years hoping for the opportunity. And somehow my name had ended up on the list. I leaned back in my chair and stared out the window. Aircraft moved across the flight line outside. Maintenance crews worked beneath the Nevada sun. Everything looked exactly the same. But nothing felt the same. Because after years of quiet effort, somebody had noticed. Somebody had looked beyond evaluations and flight hours and seen potential. The realization was overwhelming. Not because I needed validation, because I'd spent so many years without it. That evening I called my parents. Part of me wanted to share the news. Part of me still hoped. Even after all those years, even after all the disappointments, there is something inside most daughters that never fully stops wanting their parents to be proud. Mom answered on the second ring. We exchanged the usual greetings, talked about weather, neighbors, family updates. Then I told her, I got selected for something important. Oh, there was genuine interest in her voice. I smiled. One of the biggest opportunities of my career. That's wonderful, honey. For a moment I felt encouraged. Then she asked, did I tell you Jake is thinking about changing jobs? And just like that, the moment disappeared. Not because she meant to hurt me, because old habits are powerful. The conversation drifted back toward Jake, as it always seemed to. 20 minutes later, we hung up. I sat staring at my phone. Not angry, not even disappointed, mostly resigned. I understood my family by then. The rules rarely changed. The following months became some of the busiest of my life. The new assignment required additional preparation, additional training, additional responsibilities. The standards were higher. The expectations were higher. Everything was higher. I loved every minute of it. The work demanded precision, professionalism, discipline. Every detail mattered. Every maneuver mattered. Every decision mattered. There was no room for complacency. And strangely enough, that made me feel alive. Because for years I had quietly carried other people's expectations. Now I was focused entirely on my own. Back home, however, very little changed, at least not from my family's perspective. Whenever I visited Texas, I seemed to step back into the same role. The overlooked daughter, the younger sister, the safe target. One summer afternoon, my parents hosted a family barbecue, the kind of gathering common across America. Paper plates, lawn chairs, children running through sprinklers, country music playing softly in the background. Everybody relaxed, everybody comfortable, at least until Jake arrived. By then he was 37, still charismatic, still funny, still capable of making an entire group laugh. The difference was that the laughter felt different now, less joyful, more defensive. Success had never fully replaced the dream he'd lost, and I think part of him knew it. I was helping Dad near the grill when Jake walked over. Emily. Jake. He glanced at my sunglasses, then at my Air Force shirt. A familiar smirk appeared. I knew what was coming. Some things never change. So how's the military? It's good. You still doing that? I laughed softly. Last time I checked, several relatives nearby chuckled. Jake shook his head dramatically. I figured you'd be tired of playing soldier by now. The conversation around us grew quieter. People sensed tension. They always did. Nobody intervened. They rarely did. I looked at him. I like what I do. He shrugged. Good for you. Then he took a sip of his drink. And here I thought you'd eventually get a real job. Several people laughed awkwardly. The kind of laughter people use when they don't know what else to do. I noticed my mother looking down, my father focusing on the grill. Neither said anything. Again, the moment should have hurt. Years earlier it would have. Instead, I found myself feeling something unexpected. Pity. Not for myself. For Jake. Because I suddenly realized he was still fighting a battle that had ended years ago. The dream was gone. The disappointment was real. But he refused to leave that chapter behind. And it was costing him. That evening, after most of the guests had gone home, I sat alone on my parents' back porch. The Texas sky stretched endlessly overhead. Crickets filled the darkness. The air smelled like cut grass and barbecue smoke. Dad eventually joined me. For several minutes we sat quietly. Then he sighed. Your brother gives you a hard time. I smiled. A little. He stared toward the yard. You know he doesn't mean all of it. There it was. The familiar defense. The explanation. The excuse. I had heard versions of it for years. Normally I let it pass. This time I didn't. Dad. Yeah. When was the last time somebody asked him to stop? The question lingered. Neither of us spoke. Finally he looked away. And that answer told me everything. A few weeks later, a major television network announced coverage of an upcoming national air show. The event would attract enormous attention. Millions of viewers. National exposure. The kind of aviation spectacle people planned weekends around. I knew immediately that my family would watch. Jake never missed an air show. Never. Even after all these years. Especially not one this big. The irony wasn't lost on me. The little girl who had followed her brother through aviation museums and air shows was now preparing to fly in one, not as a spectator, not as a fan, as part of the show itself. Yet nobody back home knew. Not Jake. Not Mom. Not Dad. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't interested in telling them. Because some truths don't need announcements. Sometimes life reveals them on its own. And when it does, the lesson tends to be unforgettable. The morning of the air show began long before sunrise. Most people only see the performance.
The aircraft.
The smoke trails. The precision formations. The applause. They don't see the preparation. The briefings. The inspections. The hours of planning. The responsibility. And they certainly don't see the quiet moments when a pilot sits alone and realizes thousands, sometimes millions of people are about to watch. I remember standing beside the aircraft while the sky was still dark. The air was cool. The flight line lights reflected against polished metal. Ground crews moved efficiently around us. Everything felt calm, professional, routine. Yet beneath that routine was excitement. Not nervous excitement, gratitude. Because I knew exactly how many people would have traded places with me, including my brother. A few hundred miles away, my family was starting their day too. Though I wouldn't learn the details until later. According to my mother, Jake arrived early, earlier than anyone expected. He carried coffee and donuts, the way he used to whenever a big air show was on television. Apparently he was excited. Like a kid again. That part made me smile when I heard it later. Because despite everything, Jake had never stopped loving aviation. Not really. He had simply stopped believing it could be part of his own future. Those are very different things. Back at the airfield, pilots gathered for the final briefing. Weather, safety procedures, flight schedules, communication plans. The usual details. Everyone focused. Everyone professional. Nobody treated the day casually. The crowd expected perfection. And perfection requires preparation. As the briefing concluded, one of the senior officers looked around the room, then smiled. "Let's give them a show they'll remember." The room responded with quiet confidence. Not arrogance. Professional pride. There is a difference. Meanwhile, my parents had settled into the living room. My father occupied his favorite recliner. My mother sat on the couch. Jake claimed the seat closest to the television. Some things never change. The network coverage began around noon. Commentators discussed aircraft, pilots, history, upcoming demonstrations. Jake reportedly corrected the announcers several times, at least according to my mother. That sounded exactly like him. For all his flaws, he knew aviation. Always had. He pointed out aircraft models, explained maneuvers, shared facts nobody else knew. For a little while, the old Jake returned. The enthusiastic boy from those childhood air shows. The brother I used to admire. The brother I missed. By early afternoon, I was climbing into the cockpit. That moment never gets old. The smell, the equipment, the routine. Every pilot develops habits, personal rituals, small actions that signal it's time to focus. I followed mine carefully. Checklists, communications, systems, everything exactly as trained. Everything exactly as practiced. Then I looked out across the airfield. Thousands of spectators filled the viewing areas. Families, veterans, children, aviation enthusiasts, people from all over America. Some wore military hats decorated with unit patches. Others carried folding chairs and cameras. Many had been attending air shows for decades. I felt honored to be there, truly. Because opportunities like this don't belong to one person. They're built on years of support from instructors, mentors, crews, and teammates. Nobody reaches that stage alone. The demonstration began. Aircraft launched. Formations assembled. The performance unfolded exactly as planned. From the cockpit, the world looked different. Cleaner. Simpler. Focused. There is a unique clarity that comes during flight. The noise disappears. The distractions disappear. Only the mission remains. For a while, family never entered my mind. Neither did Jake. I was too busy flying. Too busy doing the job? Back in Texas, the television broadcast continued. The commentators introduced various segments. Different aircraft. Different pilots. Different demonstrations. My family watched casually. Interested. Entertained. Completely unaware of what was coming. Then the production team switched to a featured segment. A closer look at one of the demonstration pilots. The camera followed a pilot walking toward an aircraft. Helmet under one arm. Flight gear perfectly fitted. Professional. Confident. The announcer began speaking. And everything changed. According to my father, Jake stopped moving first. Not speaking. Not breathing. Moving. The announcer continued. Leading today's demonstration is Major Emily Parker. My name. Clear as day. Impossible to misunderstand. My mother later told me she thought she'd heard it wrong. She looked at the screen. Then looked again. Then sat frozen. The camera zoomed closer. Close enough to remove all doubt. There I was. Not someone who looked like me. Not someone with the same name. Me. The daughter. The sister. The family failure. Elio. The room went completely silent. Nobody knew what to say. For years they had imagined my military career as something small, ordinary, temporary. Background noise. Now reality was sitting in their living room. Broadcast nationwide. Impossible to ignore. The silence lasted several seconds. Maybe longer. Nobody remembers exactly. Shock has a strange effect on time. The aircraft accelerated. The demonstration continued. And for the next several minutes my family watched without speaking. Every maneuver. Every formation. Every pass across the sky. Jake never looked away. Neither did my parents. Years of assumptions were collapsing in real time. The daughter they overlooked. The sister they underestimated. The dream they thought belonged only to Jake. All of it unfolding before them. Not through an argument. Not through revenge. Not through confrontation. Through truth. When the broadcast ended, nobody rushed to speak. Nobody joked. Nobody changed the subject. The room remained quiet. My father eventually stood. Walked into the kitchen. Then came back. Still speechless. My mother wiped tears from her eyes. Jake remained seated, staring at the blank television screen. The same screen that had just revealed everything. The next morning, while I was reviewing post-event schedules at my temporary quarters, somebody knocked on the door. A firm knock. Unexpected. I opened it, and found my brother standing there. He looked exhausted. Like a man who hadn't slept. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Jake took a deep breath, and said the last thing I ever expected to hear from him. We need to talk. For most of my life, I imagined what I would say if Jake ever admitted he was wrong. I pictured arguments. Long speeches. Years of frustration finally pouring out. I imagined telling him exactly how much he'd hurt me. Exactly how many family dinners I'd endured. Exactly how many times I'd sat quietly while everyone acted as if my life didn't matter. But when I opened that door and saw him standing there, none of those speeches seemed important anymore. Because Jake didn't look like a man ready to argue. He looked like a man carrying something heavy. Something he'd been carrying for years. Can I come in? He asked. I stepped aside. Sure. The room was quiet. Small. Temporary. Military housing isn't glamorous. Never has been. Jake looked around. His eyes settled on framed photographs sitting on a shelf. Flight school. Graduation ceremonies. Squadron pictures.
Awards.
Years of memories. Years of work. Evidence of a life he had never bothered to ask about. For several moments he simply stared. Then he shook his head. I didn't know. No, I said gently. You didn't. We sat across from each other at a small kitchen table, the same way we'd sat across from each other at hundreds of family meals. Yet this felt entirely different. For once nobody else was there. No parents. No relatives. No audience. Just us. Jake folded his hands together, then unfolded them, then folded them again. A nervous habit I'd almost forgotten he had. Finally he spoke. When did all this happen? I smiled. What part? He gestured toward the photographs. The career. The flying. The air show. I laughed softly. Over the last 12 years, the answer wasn't meant to be sarcastic. But it landed that way anyway. Because the truth was obvious. My life hadn't been a secret. He simply hadn't been paying attention. Jake stared down at the table. I feel stupid. I considered that. Then shook my head. No. His eyes lifted. No. I think you're finally being honest. That answer seemed to surprise him. For several seconds he sat quietly. Then he nodded. Fair enough. The conversation moved slowly after that, like two people trying to cross a damaged bridge. Carefully. One step at a time. Eventually Jake leaned back in his chair. I hated watching that air show. The statement caught me off guard. Hated it. He nodded. I was proud of you. Then he looked away. And I hated it. Now I understood. Not because I shared his feelings. Because I finally understood their source. Why, I asked. Jake laughed bitterly. Because that was supposed to be me. There it was. The truth. Not jealousy. Not really. Grief. Old grief. Unresolved grief. The kind people carry so long they forget they're carrying it. For the next hour, Jake talked more honestly than I had ever heard him talk before. He told me about the medical disqualification, the embarrassment, the humiliation, the feeling of watching his future disappear. I already knew most of the facts. What I didn't know were the emotions behind them. The fear, the shame, the anger, the loneliness. For years, everyone had focused on the dream he lost. Very few people had focused on the person who lost it, including Jake himself. I kept thinking I'd find something else, he admitted. Something that felt the same. Did you? He shook his head. No, the answer came immediately. Too immediately. The kind of answer somebody has lived with for years. I got jobs. He shrugged. I made money. I paid bills. But none of it ever felt like flying. I nodded, understanding more than he realized. Because every person reaches a point where they discover the difference between making a living and feeling alive. Jake never found the second part. Then his eyes met mine. And then there was you. I stayed quiet. You kept going. Another pause. You lived the dream. The words sounded painful, but also freeing. Like finally admitting something he'd spent years avoiding. I nodded slowly. Yes. For the first time in my life, I didn't minimize it. Didn't soften it. Didn't apologize for it. I had earned it. And both of us knew it. Jake rubbed his face. I think I started blaming you. The honesty startled me, even though I'd suspected it for years. You? He nodded. It didn't make sense. I knew that. But every time you succeeded, his voice trailed off. I finished the sentence for him. It reminded you. He nodded. Exactly. Every achievement, every promotion, every step forward had reminded him of the path he'd lost. And because he couldn't fight the loss, he fought the reminder. Me. The strange thing was that hearing the truth didn't make me angry. It made me sad. Because I suddenly saw how much energy he'd wasted. Years of resentment. Years of comparison. Years spent staring backward instead of forward. And for what? Nothing. Not 1 minute of it had changed the past. A few days later, our parents joined us for dinner. The atmosphere was awkward at first. Nobody quite knew how to begin. Then my mother surprised everyone, including herself. She started crying. Not dramatically, quietly. The kind of crying that comes from realization. We failed you, she said. I blinked. What? She looked directly at me. We failed you. The room went silent. Dad stared at the table. Jake looked down. Mom continued. We were so worried about your brother. Her voice trembled. We forgot you needed us too. I didn't know what to say. Because I'd imagined apologies before. Many times. But reality felt different. Messier. More human. Less satisfying. And somehow more meaningful. Dad finally spoke. We thought we were helping him. You were, I said. He nodded. Maybe. Then he sighed. But we stopped seeing what it was costing you. Nobody argued. Because everybody knew it was true. Eventually the conversation softened. The tension eased. The honesty remained. For the first time in years, we weren't pretending. And that mattered. More than revenge. More than being right. More than winning. Before leaving that evening, Jake walked me to my car. The sun was beginning to set. The sky glowed orange over the Texas horizon. He stood quietly for a moment, then asked a question. A simple question, but one that carried the weight of years. Why didn't you ever tell us? I looked at him, and for the first time I knew exactly how to answer. For years I thought I knew exactly how I would answer that question. Why didn't you ever tell us? I imagined saying something dramatic, something sharp, something that would finally make everyone understand. But standing there beside my car looking at my brother, I realized the answer was much simpler than that. I did tell you. Jake frowned. What? I told you every time somebody asked. The confusion remained. So I smiled. I joined the Air Force. He nodded. I know. I told you when I graduated training. Another nod. I told you when I got promoted. Yeah, I told you when I changed assignments. His expression slowly shifted. The pieces were finally connecting. I wasn't talking about secrets. I was talking about attention. For years, the information had been available. Nobody had listened. Not really. Not completely. Not with genuine curiosity. Jake stared toward the fading horizon, then laughed quietly. A sad laugh. The kind people make when they finally recognize a truth they'd spent years avoiding. We never asked. No, we didn't. And somehow those 3 words carried more honesty than anything he'd said before. Oh, on the flight home the next day I spent a lot of time looking out the window. Clouds stretched endlessly beneath the aircraft. The world seemed peaceful from 30,000 feet. Smaller somehow. Less complicated. Distance has a way of doing that. Problems that feel enormous on the ground often look different from above. Not insignificant. Just easier to understand. For years I had carried resentment toward my family. Not overwhelming resentment. Not hatred. Just a quiet ache. The ache of feeling unseen. The ache of watching someone else's pain matter more than your own. The ache of realizing that being the dependable child often means receiving less attention than the struggling one. Many people my age understand that feeling, especially those who grew up in families where one person's crisis became everybody else's priority. Looking down at those clouds, I finally understood something. My parents hadn't loved me less. They had simply worried about Jake more. Those aren't the same thing, and while that realization didn't erase the hurt, it helped me understand it. Understanding changes things. Over the next several months, something unusual happened. My family started paying attention. Not in a dramatic way. Not overnight. Slowly. Naturally. Mom called more often. Not to discuss Jake, to ask about me. The first time it happened, I almost laughed. She called one evening while I was making dinner. After a few minutes of conversation, she asked, "So what are you working on these days?" I actually paused because I couldn't remember the last time she'd asked. Not politely. Not out of obligation. With genuine interest. We spent nearly 40 minutes talking. About aviation. Travel. Career goals. Life. When we hung up, I stood in my kitchen for a long moment. Smiling. Sometimes healing doesn't arrive with grand gestures. Sometimes it arrives through small questions that should have been asked years ago. Dad changed too. Though in his own way. One afternoon he mailed me a newspaper clipping. A local article about aviation. Nothing particularly special. Except for the handwritten note attached. Saw this and thought of you. Love, Dad. That was it. 12 words. Yet I probably read them 20 times. Because after years of feeling overlooked, even small signs of recognition carry enormous weight. So, the biggest change, however, came from Jake. Not immediately. Growth rarely happens immediately. But it happened. Gradually. Steadily. One choice at a time. For the first time in years, he stopped comparing our lives. Stopped measuring his losses against my successes. Stopped treating every accomplishment of mine as evidence of his failure. The transformation wasn't dramatic. It was something better. It was real. One evening he called me unexpectedly. I signed up for flight lessons. I nearly dropped my phone. What? He laughed. You heard me. I sat down. Honestly stunned. At 37 years old, Jake wasn't trying to become a fighter pilot. That chapter was over. He knew it. I knew it. But for the first time in nearly 2 decades, he was reconnecting with the thing he loved instead of mourning the thing he lost. That mattered. A lot. How was it? I asked. There was a pause. Then I heard something I hadn't heard from him in years. Pure excitement. It was incredible. And just like that, I heard the boy from those childhood air shows again. The boy who stared at airplanes with wonder. The boy who dreamed without bitterness. The boy I'd missed. The following summer, another major air show came to Texas. This time my family attended in person. Not because I asked. Because they wanted to. Mom brought sunscreen. Dad brought binoculars. Jake showed up wearing an aviation cap that looked older than some of the spectators. The sight made me laugh. Before the event began, we stood together near the flight line. The sun was bright. The crowd was enormous. Children pointed toward aircraft. Veterans shared stories. Families spread blankets across the grass. America has a special relationship with air shows. They're part celebration, part history lesson, part family tradition. Standing there with my parents and my brother felt strangely emotional, not because I was flying, because for the first time in years we were sharing the experience together. No resentment, no competition, no old arguments, just family. Later that afternoon, after the demonstration ended, we sat together watching the crowd disperse. Jake nudged my shoulder, a familiar gesture from childhood. I was wrong about you. I smiled. You were wrong about a lot of things. He laughed. Fair enough. Then his expression softened. I'm proud of you, Em. The words were simple, ordinary. Yet somehow they meant more than any television broadcast ever could. Because this wasn't about being seen by millions of strangers. It was about being seen by the people who mattered. As I look back now, I realize something important. The greatest victory wasn't appearing on television. It wasn't earning wings. It wasn't proving anybody wrong. The greatest victory was learning that my worth never depended on their approval. Not my brother's, not my parents', not anyone's. Once I understood that, everything changed. Success became lighter. Relationships became healthier. Life became richer. And maybe that's the lesson hidden inside this story. Sometimes the people closest to us don't see us clearly. Sometimes they underestimate us. Sometimes they carry wounds that prevent them from recognizing our strengths. But we don't have to wait for recognition before moving forward. We don't have to wait for applause before becoming who we're meant to be. If this story reminded you of someone in your own life, or perhaps a chapter of your own journey, I hope you'll take a moment to reflect on it. And if you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or quietly working towards something meaningful, remember this. Keep going. The people around you may not see your progress right away, but that doesn't make it any less real. And if you enjoyed spending this time with me, I'd be honored if you'd share your thoughts, share this story with someone who might need it, and join me again for another journey.